can oppression help produce masterpieces? Do we need rules and constraints to fuel our creativity, or should ever greater freedom be our continuing goal? Now, joining me to discuss are Lowkey, a.k.a. Kareem Dennis. He's a British-Iraqi hip-hop artist and activist. Joanna Kavenna is the winner of the Orange First Novel Prize. Joanna's works include A Field Guide to Reality, the Ice Museum and Inglorious. Andrew Motion, at the end there, is Professor of Arts at Johns Hopkins University. And Andrew, you were the UK Poet Laureate for 10 years, and you're also the author of Coming Into Land and Philip Larkin, A Writer's Life. So our opening question, and I'm going to put it to you first, Lowkey, is freedom vital for creativity to flourish?
Okay, so firstly, what's interesting about this is we're being asked to think on a premise that oppression or constraint leads to better art. So now what I want to argue is that there is a worst case scenario of this conclusion and a best case scenario of this conclusion. The best case scenario of this conclusion, that oppression creates somehow greater or more beautiful works, is in its absolute best, what it acts to do within our minds is to make more tolerable repression and violence against thinkers who go outside of the norm. And at its very worst, what it does is it credits the brilliance of people rather than to the people that produce those works, but to the people that oppress them. So if I can make it more simple for you, it's the equivalent of us saying that Galileo's work on the laws of physics were thanks to Pope Urban because he put him under house arrest and put him in the position where that happened. It's the equivalent of us saying that Ibn al-Haytham's development of the idea that the ancient Greeks had as their conviction that light was shot out by the eyes, and that's what enabled people to see. So Ibn al-Haytham, when put under house arrest by the Fatimid caliphs at that time, because of being under house arrest and having a hole in the wall, he was able to fashion that into an understanding that in fact what happens is light reflects off of objects and therefore the eye sees. So what we're in danger of doing is crediting the people that tighten the constraints with the brilliance of the people who, despite their circumstances, are able to make great leaps for humanity. So the question also is that would these people, if they enjoyed state patronage rather than state restriction, not come out with equally, if not more, amazing ideas? We see from history examples of people like Victor Jara in Chile. For example, during the Salvador Allende government, democratically elected government, he was patronized by the state. He enjoyed state sponsorship. The music he created was beautiful and spoke to and for millions. However, following the coup on September 11th, 1973, backed by the British and US government and the introduction of General Pinochet as the ruler of Chile, Victor Jara was imprisoned in Chile Stadium along with 5,000 other people. During his torture, he actually set about writing his last song, which was called Chile Stadium. It was an unfinished work which was smuggled out of the stadium by a friend of his who put it into his sock. This is a perfect example of state repression leading to somebody actually dying. So this idea of oppression creating great work. We also see the work that he created was actually unfinished. So it's very easy for us to sometimes philosophize about situations we have not lived through and pontificate about the possibility that oppression or state restriction somehow leads to greater art. So I would say that is my position on this.
Wonderful. Thank you. Very strong gambit. Let me ask you, Joanna, is freedom vital for creativity to flourish?
Reminds me a bit of the old Samizdat joke. I'm totally free. I'm free to write my work myself. I'm free to edit it myself, free to publish it myself, free to go to jail myself. This idea of freedom is obviously totally fundamental. So, I'm going to agree a lot with what Lowkey said, actually. Original work in whatever discipline we're defining it, whether we're talking about originality in science, as Lowkey's mentioned, or in art, in music, poetry, prose, it fundamentally requires a pushing at the limits all the time of what is known and what is acceptable and what is tasteful and decorous. And it won't be original and innovative and exciting if it isn't fundamentally doing that. So it may clash with precepts and conventions, of course, and that the artist and the creative person needs that freedom. And if they're constantly anticipating some kind of control or censorship as a result of what they're doing in the privacy of their own creative realm, then they won't be free as they do that. Of course, that external pressure will come into the creative process. And so there's that point about the creator, but there's also the point about the audience. You don't create in a vacuum, ideally. So any form of censorship or control of what can be said or created implies that someone's going to stand between the creator and the audience, and they make the decision for the audience about what the audience can know and see and hear. And who will do that? Who will be the censor? Who amongst us today would like to take that role, will stand and say, I will decide what each one of us here is going to know about the world. So there's a crucial point in censorship about knowledge that I think in a free society we have the right to know as well what's being said and thought. So, and I don't agree with the notion that oppression causes great art. Salman Rushdie said it's a bit like saying it's so wonderful that man lost both his arms because now he paints so beautifully with the paintbrush in his mouth. It's an invidious notion, of course. And try telling that to Garcia Lorca, who was murdered by Franco's thugs, or Radcliffe Hall, whose work was totally silenced because she wrote about love between women. Try telling it to Ai Weiwei, who's been forced out of his own country and lost any contact day by day with his mother and his wife. Try telling that to them, that the pressure, therefore, means that you are the censored, and that's what you're the silenced, and your work is assessed on that premise as well. So all people talk about is that your work is censored, and that's what's happened to it. So this actually brings me this idea of silencing. So it's not entirely the same as what we're talking about with formal constraint. And there's a question within the rubric about constraint and restraint as a formal suggestion. That doesn't necessarily oppress. Shakespeare wrote 5-act plays, poets use stanzas and form, and musicians use musical forms, and I write novels. That is a different thing, but you may have a kind of ideologue like Stalin who just likes realism and stops people like the Russian absurdists from writing fantasy and imposes a restriction on a form. That may be a form of oppression, but it's not necessarily linked. So I will end. The art's an opinion about the world. It can be completely transformative, and it has to be free. And who has not been radically inspired and transformed by works of art, even perhaps by those artists who've been banned and censored by Leonardo himself, Michelangelo, Voltaire, D.H. Lawrence, Radcliffe Hall, Nadine Gordimer, Salman Rushdie, Toni Morrison, Orhan Pamuk, Solzhenitsyn, Chan Kun-chung, Liu Xiaobo. I could continue, alas. Turgenev said, without freedom in the widest sense of the word, the artist is unthinkable. And Salman Rushdie said, art is not entertainment, at its best it is a revolution. Thanks.
Wow, thank you. I feel quite invigorated by that. Andrew, lastly is freedom vital for creativity to flourish?
The bad thing about coming third in a panel of three is that a lot of things you wanted to say have already been said. There's not a thing that's been said that I disagree with.
You have to be creative, Andrew.
I'm going to be creative. I'm going to be as creative as I can in a minute. The idea that art thrives on impression in a simple way is clearly ridiculous and very well said by Lowkey and also by Joanna. And it has a social dimension too, of course, this. It would be like saying, let's throw lots of Christians to the lions so that the Church of England statistics look better again, and more people go to church. I mean, clearly a ridiculous idea. But what I wanted to do is slightly different, perhaps, with a bit more thinking about form, which is something that we can continue to think about in the next few minutes. And I wanted to start by thinking about material circumstances, which is to say the degree of freedom is necessary for creativity to exist, a degree of peace and quiet, a degree of provision, space, materials, and possibly, but not necessarily at the point of creation, a sense of audience, which begins to be, I think, part of your point. In fact, the sort of things that Virginia Woolf talks about in A Room of One's Own, not even Solzhenitsyn and Mandelstam could have written without a modicum of these things. And it's very noticeable if you think about First World War poetry that Wilfred Owen and Sassoon wrote their best poems not at the front when they were under fire, oppression of a sort. It's not sort of narrowly political oppression, but of oppression of a sort. Didn't write their best poems at the front. They wrote their best poems when they were back in the war hospital in Craiglockhart.
For more debates, talks and interviews, subscribe today to the Institute of Art and Ideas at IAI TV.